How can we fix the global economy? That's the topic for today. I'm going to share an overview of the different steps that I think are most important for fixing the economy. Now, I'm not going to explain the economic ideas that I'm going to be talking about in this video. If you want to fully understand everything that I'm going to mention in this video, you'll need to pause this video and go watch my Understanding the Economy video series, which you'll find on my YouTube playlists. And you should also ideally watch the videos for which economic system should we fix first and 3 ways to fix the economy. Right, so assuming you've already watched those videos, this is going to be a high-level plan on how we can fix the global economy. To arrive at this suggested plan, I've looked at and thought about as many economic theories, ideas, and systems as possible to think about how we could most effectively fix these systems. I've also been trying to link these ideas together and think about which ideas are the most compelling to start with and what knock-on effects could happen when you adopt one idea and how that could impact the other ideas. This diagram is the end result. The goal of this diagram is to simply help with planning and strategizing how we can most quickly and effectively fix the global economy. What we really want to avoid is economic collapse. So these ideas are intended as a path to achieve that. However, one of the things I can say straight away is that governments are likely going to play a vital role in influencing whether their economies collapse or not. Governments will greatly influence which ideas are going to be adopted and at what speed. Governments are currently running out of time to make the right choices. So this plan of how to fix the economy is intended as the most desirable path, instead of the one where the economy has already collapsed and we have to rebuild a number of systems from scratch. With that all in mind, let's jump in and go through each of the phases for fixing the global economy. Now, the 4 phases I've added are just sensible groupings. You could implement all of the ideas to do with land before you implement anything to do with money. These groupings make it easier to look at all of the things you might start in phase 1 and the things you could do in parallel to one another. After that, you can then look at what things would logically come next, what ideas and knock-on effects could be enabled due to the ideas that were adopted in the previous phase. Let's start with phase 1 and think about land. Most countries don't have land value taxes, and a number of countries don't have property taxes. The easiest starting point for countries that don't have either of these taxes is likely to start with a property tax. The benefit of using an annual property tax is that the tax will include some of the value of the land. This is an easier starting point to improve taxation, as you don't have to generate land valuations separately from the property. The sale price information for each property and the surrounding properties should be sufficient for determining the valuations that are going to be used for working out an annual property taxation rate. Moving onward to money. The key thing that we highlighted in a previous video is to adopt money taxes that there is likely a need for 2 steps. The first step is stablecoin adoption, and this will be important so we can migrate towards newer technology. Web3 technology will make it easier to implement future changes that are necessary, such as for adopting a money tax. It doesn't make much sense to try and update really outdated financial systems that fiat money is currently using. Stablecoin regulation will be necessary for mainstream adoption. Regulations will mean that people can start to adopt and integrate this technology into different digital services. Moving on to governments. Governments can start to incentivize the adoption of worker cooperatives by providing some small incentive for people to adopt this type of structure. Now, that could be something as simple as a tax break, where normal companies, limited by shares, pay one tax rate, and cooperatives pay some slightly reduced amount. That's just one idea. Our environment, natural resources, and biodiversity have been degrading for a number of decades. So, the first step towards resolving this is looking at what processes and regulations could be adopted within government to better protect these natural resources. As a starting point, it makes sense to initially focus on the most scarce or the most important resources that need to be more immediately protected and used more sensibly. These changes make for a good start. Now we can move on to phase 2. For land, once property taxes have already been adopted, the next step is to really start focusing on the land, trying to value the land separately from the buildings on top of the land. Once you've done this, you can start to introduce a small rate of taxation that is solely based on the land rental value. In this earlier phase, this might mean starting with 5% and then going up to 25% of the full land rental income. Starting small is important. It helps to prevent punishing people who just bought a house. You want to avoid causing sudden price drops and market volatility. Moving on to money. The adoption of stablecoins will have a number of positive knock-on effects. First, we should expect to see more mainstream adoption of stablecoins, and this can include more open source solutions that other countries might want to use for their own implementations. Traditional finance, like the banking sector, will eventually need to adopt and integrate stablecoins, or they will increasingly become less relevant in the financial market. This adoption should eventually lead to more integration and interoperability between Web3 networks and traditional finance applications. We should also see a lot of innovation and development across Web3 wallets, thanks to more adoption and exposure due to the growing demand and usage of stablecoins. One of the great knock-on effects of stablecoin adoption will be how people will get more control over their financial lives due to the usage of decentralized financial applications. They'll have a growing number of options to consider when participating in the financial markets, such as lending their stablecoins in lending and borrowing protocols, or providing liquidity in token exchanges. Another thing we could expect to see due to stablecoin adoption is more innovations in privacy solutions. A number of people are going to prefer a certain level of privacy when they are transacting. For governments, we should expect a continuation of support for worker cooperatives. This could mean increasing the incentives over time for people to use and adopt collectively owned ownership structures. The other thing that governments can do once they introduce a land value tax is they can start to remove the distortionary taxes that might exist. Property taxes are one of those distortionary taxes, as this tax can disincentivize people to further develop their property, as this can eventually lead to a higher rate of property taxation. A reasonable starting point could be to start reducing the property taxes in favor of land value taxes. This can be done gradually over time. Council taxes, taxes for selling or buying property, or property development taxes are all other examples of taxation that could also be reduced or potentially removed as the taxation rate on land value is increased. Identity credentials are a compelling knock-on effect from stablecoin adoption. If everyone starts using Web3 technology due to stablecoins, it becomes much easier to develop and integrate identity solutions. A great initial use case for governments to consider is the adoption of identity credentials for things like driver's licenses or passports. This means the government would issue these credentials to users, and these credentials would represent a passport or driver's license as a document. This credential is verifiable. People would store and manage these credentials and then use them to prove who they are, and potentially even sign documents and contracts. As governments learn more about how they could govern and protect natural resources, the next phase of development would be around how to automate some of the solutions where possible and bring in collective influence from the wider community when this makes sense to do so. A number of organizations will be impacted due to the ongoing adoption of Web3 technology. We could expect to see more Web3 solutions that reduce the value of some digital services. Escrow contracts, digital wallet signing tools, crowdfunding contracts with refund guarantees, or digital transaction receipts when buying goods and services. All of these small but important pieces of functionality could end up replacing a number of organizations that people are using today. As more of this functionality gets implemented over time, it should really start to shape and improve these new and emerging digital systems. At this stage, a number of smaller organizations may be ready to fully embrace and adopt Web3 solutions. These organizations may want to experiment with new tools and solutions that could help with governance or how they operate their organization. You can already start to see the range of exciting things that could happen after you adopt stablecoins at scale. Now for phase 3. For land, you would continue to slowly increase the taxation rate so it moves closer towards the full land rental value. In this phase, that might mean slowly moving from around 30% up to 65%. This will also be a good time to start thinking about what experiments you could run in local areas. Local communities could start voting on how land value tax income is used to improve their own local community. These communities also might want to experiment with new identity solutions that help with making voting easier and quicker. The tools and software that get built for valuing land should also ideally be developed open source from the very beginning. Open source software will mean that any other country will be able to adopt these solutions or learn from them and make their own systems. This is one of the great knock-on effects of adopting new taxation approaches, is the solutions and learnings can easily spread and be used in other countries. For money, stablecoins should now have mainstream adoption, which then enables the second step of fixing the system of money. Eventually, fiat money needs to migrate away from the old, outdated technology that it currently uses and instead fully embrace better technology that can more easily enable things like a money tax. Once there is mainstream adoption of stablecoins, a government can set up a deadline for when the system will migrate from being an inflationary storable system of money into a deflationary demerged system. Adopting a money tax helps to achieve the desired outcome of creating a demerge-based system of money. When this change happens, the money tax would become another income source for the government. Another thing that we could expect to see after the ongoing adoption of stablecoins is the adoption of digital assets. That could mean digital tokens that represent ownership in different assets, like real estate or gold. These assets could also be deposited in financial protocols like token exchanges. Stablecoins would be a really good liquidity pairing with those assets. So stablecoins will likely help with speeding up the creation and adoption of digital assets. Governments that have experimented with and adopted identity credentials can now look at experimenting with credential-based voting systems. This might just start out with local council elections, but it might also mean national elections. The tax income that is being generated from land and money could also be collectively governed by the community that it was intended for. Systems could be introduced to experiment with how people make decisions and how community funds should and will be spent. The next distortionary tax we want to focus on after reducing property-related taxes is income. As the land value tax increases, any income taxes could be reduced. This will help to increase the incentives for people to provide their labour. The final phase for protecting our environment will be one where we can automate the oversight and usage of our natural resources. At this phase, we shouldn't be seeing much resource misuse or any further biodiversity collapse, and that's if the right solutions have been properly adopted. For organizations, they will now be adapting to the growing amount of adoption for Web3 technology. In this phase, the scale of the adoption should be creating opportunities to start replacing the more established centralized providers for things like marketplaces or social media networks. And now let's finally go through phase 4. This would be the final phase for land value taxes, which would now be slowly moving towards taxing the full land rental value. This should now represent a very meaningful amount of tax income. A compelling use case for both Web3 network coins and money is to use it for contract collateral. Contract collateral is a type of pledge or security deposit that helps to increase the trust between two parties. Collateral from both sides helps to increase the incentive that they both honor the agreement that was made in the contract. If money becomes a mandated form of collateral in commonly used contracts, this achieves two things. The first is it can make it safer and easier to transact with people you don't know or trust, as both parties have an incentive to honor the agreement. This should make it more difficult to scam someone. The second thing is it creates more demand for Web3 network coins and money. Deflationary money creates demand for money, which is due to the increasing price of money relative to goods and services. Demerge money reduces demand for money, as people are losing a small amount of it periodically due to something like a money tax. So, adding another use case for Web3 network coins and money as a legal form of contract collateral is highly desirable, as it creates another source of demand for these assets. Another thing that could be introduced is financial incentives. These incentives could encourage people to use their money more productively. Now, this could mean having a higher taxation rate for when money is sitting idle in a wallet, and then a reduced taxation rate when the money is deposited as financial collateral. Incentives like this can help with encouraging people to use their money in a way that is more productive in the economy. Government can now look to ban perpetual shares of ownership once there is enough adoption of collectively owned organizations like cooperatives or other temporary ownership structures. With identity and credential systems becoming more mainstream, the governance systems for nation states could now evolve and enable more direct democracy on important issues. Liquid democracy is another useful improvement to these systems, and that would enable voters to delegate their voting power to someone else for specific decisions and topic areas. After property and income taxes have been reduced or removed, another distortionary tax that governments could now reduce is corporation taxes. Money taxes and land value taxes, coupled with some corrective taxes where necessary, should now have helped with reducing or removing most or all of the undesirable distortionary taxes. In this final phase, organizations should now be collectively owned across the world. Some of these changes will be due to Web3 technology, which over time will replace a number of the products and services we use today with open source protocols and applications. Governments would have also played a part in this replacement of companies with perpetual shares of ownership, and that's by increasingly incentivizing the adoption of collectively owned organization using things like tax breaks. All right, that's it. We're done for now. That was a high-level summary on my current thoughts about how we can fix the global economy. This was version 1 of this diagram, so of course I've likely missed something. So I might update this in the coming months or so. Land value taxes have some positive knock-on effects, and they also represent a very meaningful amount of tax income in the long term for governments. Land value taxes help with the reduction and removal of some of the most harmful distortionary taxes that are commonly used today. Adopting stablecoins will have an incredible amount of knock-on effects, and they also help with generating meaningful amounts of tax income when money taxes are eventually adopted. But the most compelling aspect for stablecoins is how Web3 adoption can help with the ongoing evolution of how we structure and operate governments, organizations, and money. A link to this diagram is in the description, and I hope you found this useful or at least somewhat interesting. And that now completes this video series on how to fix the global economy. I'll see you all in the next one.